you to hopefully the first of many remembrances of the Lockhart, look back in time. We're very excited about putting this presentation together. We've talked about it for a long time, and we have two fine speakers. We want to thank Joe Henry Bunch, who could not. We want to thank them. We want to thank Randy and Julia Seltzer for doing the video production of this bunch and helping with us tonight, and that will be on tape as well. And welcome to the third floor of the library, something we're very proud of. And hope y'all enjoy the experience and know that it's available for use throughout the community. I want to introduce the moderator for tonight. We have Ms. Ronda Reagan here, who has authored a book about the history of Lockhart. He has some fabulous pictures. It's available in the foyer, and she's going to kick our presentation off.
Thank you, Mayor White. Well, Donaly, how are you tonight?
I'm fine.
Great. You know, I thought I'd ask you a few questions. I have just a few pages here to go through tonight. So I'm going to start by asking you, how did we come into existence here in Lockhart, Harlow County?
That's a good question. It's not a real simple answer, but the county that we're living in today was originally a part of the northern part of Gonzales County. It was originally, before it was a county, it was part of the Greenby-Witt colony. There was the Stephen F. Austin colony, there was the Greenby-Witt colony, and several others. And Greenby-Witt's colony extended all the way up to the old Camino Real, which is basically Highway 21 that runs out here. It's the northern boundary of Caldwell County. So we were the northern part of the Greenby-Witt colony. The settlers began moving into Caldwell County in the mid-1840s. And I'm going to have to regress back about 5 years before that and explain to you why there was no one really living in this area before 1840. That's because of a group of people called the Comanches. And they were very good at what they did. They had kept the Spaniards from settling Texas. They had kept the Spanish or the Mexicans from settling Texas to their desire. And so when the Anglos started coming into Texas, they too had a real problem with the Comanches. But in 1840, the Comanches decided that they wanted to negotiate a peace settlement with the Texans. And so they appeared on the outskirts of San Antonio and under a white flag of truce, and they told the Texans they wanted to negotiate this peace treaty. The Texans were all in favor of that. They said, you have to go back and get your captives, white captives that you brought in, that you've taken over the last few years, and bring them in and exchange them, or bring them back to us, and we will talk to you about a peace treaty. They agreed to do this, and in March of 1840, the Comanches returned to San Antonio. They not only brought their chiefs with them, but they brought their whole tribes practically. And the town was full of Comanche Indians. They took the 12 chiefs that arrived into the old courthouse on Military Plaza, which was called the council house. And that's where they were going to have the peace negotiations. It was a very small little building, probably about a fourth the size of this entire room. It probably was even smaller than that, actually. And they took the 12 chiefs in, and the peace negotiators went in, sat down, The Indians had brought in one white captive, a young girl, 16-year-old girl named Matilda Lockhart, who they had captured several years before down off the San Antonio River, or the Guadalupe River, down near Cuero. The Texans, the first question they had for the chiefs were, where are the rest of your captives that you were supposed to bring in? They said this was the only one we have. They didn't believe the Indians because Matilda Lockhart had told the Texans that there were more captives in the campsites. And so the Texans had armed troops in this council house room just in case something like this might happen, because the Texans didn't trust the Indians. And after what happened next, the Indians probably shouldn't have had much trust in the Texans either, because the Texans informed the 12 chiefs that they were going to be held as hostages until the rest of the people in their tribe went back and got the other captives and brought them in. You can imagine how well that set with the Comanche chiefs. And so they armed themselves and tried to fight their way out of this little room, which was the biggest mistake of the day, because the armed Texans had surrounded them, and all 12 of the chiefs were killed. There were a number of white settlers or white negotiators that were killed in the fight as well, because they were shooting across this little room. They were in a big circle just shooting, and there was a lot of friendly fire casualties. And before you knew it, there were a lot of dead people in that council house. When the Indians outside heard what was happening, they started fighting with the settlers or the citizens who had come down to gawk at the Indians, because they were kind of novelty things to the white people. And so fighting erupted out in the streets of San Antonio. It ended up that day, basically, all of the Indians were either captured or killed, and the captives were taken out to San Jose Mission, where they were incarcerated. They sent several of them off to tell them to go get the rest of their captives and bring them back, and they released the rest of the Indians. Well, a few captives did get repatriated, I guess you'd say, after that incident. But the Texans realized that there was going to be trouble because of what happened in San Antonio, because the Indians thought the treachery on the part of the Texans warranted some retaliation. And it was not until August of 1840, it went through the whole summer, nothing happened. But in 1840, a series of events occurred which basically led to the settlement of what is now Caldwell County. The Indians, about 500, 600, 700 in number, swept down out of the hill country, made their way through what is now Caldwell County. They followed Plum Creek, and they got down to near Gonzales, and they went to the east of Gonzales and skirted around the settled areas. And it wasn't until the Indians had gotten all the way to Victoria that they realized, the people realized, that there was a hostile Indian party in the vicinity. The Indians attacked Victoria on August the 6th, and the people were not prepared. Many of them were killed, or their homes were burned, and they fled to the center of the town for protection, and they held off the Indian attack. But the Indians gathered up several thousand horses and mules that had been staked out on the prairies outside of Victoria, that had been brought there to sell and trade with the Texans by Mexican traders from South Texas. And so the Indians got all of these horses. They attacked the town again the next morning, and then they broke off their attack. But during the night, a number of the settlers there got out and spread the word that there was a hostile Indian war party that had attacked Victoria and were in the vicinity. And so they decided that they were going to have to intercept the Indians and stop them somewhere. The Indians didn't turn and go back to the hill country once they got these horses. Instead, they continued straight down toward the Texas coast, and on August 8th, they attacked the small port town of Linville, which was a little port city there. It was about a mile or two from the outskirts of what is now Port Lavaca. They burned the town, they took some captives, they killed some more people, and the citizens had to flee out into the shallow waters of Lavaca Bay and wade out and get on small boats out in the harbor for protection, because they had no other way to protect themselves. And all day long they watched as the Indians looted the warehouses at the port town and burned the town to the ground. The Indians finally had enough. They loaded all this plunder that they had gotten on their horses that they had stolen at Victoria, and they started back to the hill country. By now, word had spread all over Texas, or central and south Texas, that there was a hostile Indian party in the area. And so they decided, they figured out the route that the Indians had taken. It's hard to ride 700 horses through Texas and not be able to detect where they went. And it was not difficult to figure out the route that the Indians took from the hill country to Victoria to Linville. And they noticed that they were following the route back the same way they came down to the coast. They were heading back to the hill country. So the Texans knew exactly where they had to intercept them. And they said, we're going to intercept them at Plum Creek, just north of Gonzales. And I say that because there was no Lockhart here at that time. This is what leads to Lockhart becoming a town and the county being created, because once the Indians were defeated at the Battle of Plum Creek, it opened up the whole south central Texas area to a rapid settlement by the settlers. Now, there were quite a number of famous people that were in the Battle of Plum Creek, and we could go on and on with their names. There was John Hayes. Hayes County was named for him. He later became one of the great ranger captains and was a major player in the Mexican War later. Ben and Henry McCullough, Benjamin McCullough came from Gonzales area and later became a general in the Civil War. Henry McCullough was in charge, his brother was in charge of Texas troops in North Texas during the Civil War. Edward Burleson came from Bastrop. He was famous as a famous Indian fighter. Matthew Caldwell, for whom the county was named, and was also a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence, was in this fight. So there were a lot of famous Texans from the Republic period in the fight. Now, this opened up this whole area in 1840. By 1842, there was enough people in the area to warrant having a post office out on Plum Creek, out east of what is now Lockhart. And by 1845, people started settling around the springs here in what's now Lockhart. This was in 1845. By 1847, it was decided there were enough people living here, and it was a real challenge to handle the normal routine business of the county, to have to get your wagon or a horseback and ride 30 miles down to the county seat at Gonzales. They needed a county courthouse and a county seat somewhere closer to transact business. Now, a group got together, they petitioned, they drew up a petition and signed it, and they appointed a committee of men to take this petition to Austin to the legislature to get it passed into law to create a new county out of Gonzales County. And in 1848, that's exactly what happened. The Caldwell County was created. One of the things I think is very interesting in the creation of the county is when the settlers got together to do this, one of the first names that they chose to name this county was Christian County. And then that didn't go over. They decided they were going to name it Good County because there was a man living out on Plum Creek out here east of Lockhart whose name was Isham Good, and I'm sure he had something to do with them suggesting they name the county Good County. Finally, they decided they're going to name it Plum Creek County. So we might have had Plum Creek County had it not been for the fact that the legislature, somewhere in their committee hearings and all, somebody decided, no, we don't want Plum Creek County. We want to name it after somebody who's well known, and that would have been Matthew Caldwell. By that time, Caldwell had died, and being a signer of the Declaration of Independence for Texas and being a participant in the Battle of Plum Creek, they decided that would be the person they were going to name the county for. And so that's how the county got its name. And so on March 6, 1848, they created the county. Now the Springs are what brought the first settlers to Lockhart. As a matter of fact, the first town here was called Lockhart Springs. A lot of people don't know that. And when they petitioned the legislature to create the county, and they wanted to name the county seat, they had Lockhart Springs on it, and they inked it out. You could barely see what it says, which is sort of interesting. The Bird Lockhart, for whom the town was named, was a surveyor in the Green DeWitt colony in the 1830s and 20s. And he had surveyed all this land in this area. He lived in Gonzales, but he knew the land, and he knew these springs were here on this land. And he was being paid for his surveying by land being given to him in various places around the state, and he got to choose what he wanted. And he picked a league of land, maybe more than a league of land, right here in this area because of the springs that were here. He knew this was a prime property. And so this is what he did. He chose this piece of property. I know this may get tedious, but I've got to read something that came out of a newspaper out of Austin in 1849. This was really early. This was just a few years after the first settlers started moving in here in 1845. And I think this is very interesting. It tells you about how the county developed so quickly. It says, Caldwell County, in the area comprised in this little county, in 1843 there were only 6 voters. So of course that was only men over the age of 21, you remember. Women and people under 21 didn't get to vote. 1843 there were 6 voters. In 1846, 3 years later, there were 13. 1847, there were 86. 1848, there were 122. And in 1849, there were almost 200 voters. And it goes on to say, Lockhart Springs, the county seat, was laid off some 18 months since and now contains 250 inhabitants. There are 2 grist mills and 1 sawmill in operation within 4 miles of town. The county abounds in fine springs with abundance of pure soft water and sandstone sufficiently large and firm for building purposes. And it goes on and on, but I thought that was interesting that they talk about the springs. They don't say how many springs were here. It says they abound in fine springs. In 1853, another newspaper talks about Lockhart, and it says, it mentions 150 springs of pure crystal water in and around town, bursting and boiling up in every direction and winding their peaceful way to the falls, where they suddenly assume a frolicsome mood and leap and dash over the 20-feet precipice and are lost in mingling with the waters of the troubled stream below. Boy, let me tell you, this guy was waxing poetic. But one thing about this is interesting. He says there are 150 springs. And I think he was probably exaggerating. He sounds he exaggerates a little bit. He's talking about the falls. There was a drop-off in the falls right down behind the recycle center, down on that creek, right there where the city park is. And it evidently was, they called it the falls on Plum Creek. But Judge William Cowan in 1867 wrote an article for the Texas Almanac for that year, and he says that, he goes on to say, the town of Lockhart, situated 30 miles south of Austin, the capital of the state. It's a site of great beauty, being situated in a grove of live oak, overhung with moss, with the open prairie stretching away immediately on the west and south, and having the celebrated Lockhart Springs forming a semicircle of rills and ravines overlooked by a picturesque post oak and live oak elevation from the north and the east. These Lockhart Springs are about 20 in number and supply the town abundantly with excellent water. So he says there were only 20 here, and that's probably closer to being accurate. But I thought that some of these descriptions of early Lockhart are just really fascinating because that's the only places that you really get a description of our town and our county when it was founded. Although there were a lot of Lockhart Springs, there was one set of springs which was on North Commerce Street, right down by the railroad track where Christ's Market is now located. And these springs were called Story Springs, and they were named for the Story family, who was a very early family that settled here. And one of the reasons I want to bring the Story Springs up is that those springs, where all those oak trees are along in there, that was where Sam Houston came here in the 1850s and gave, when he was campaigning as governor, and he came here and spoke, and they had a big all-day affair where thousands of people came to listen to him speak. And I thought that was interesting. There again, the springs drew people into that.